All right, so with us today is Sydney. Sydney has, I've actually known her for quite a while. We've got a history professionally. And when I first started this series, goodness, 2 years ago, I think, Sydney, you were the first one who was like, yes, I will present. And I was so excited because it's always nerve-wracking starting up something new. And I think this season rolled around. And again, I put the call out to professionals of, hey, who wants to just share valuable information with parents in our community? And again, Sydney was like the first one in my inbox. He's like, yes, I love to share. I've got it. I want to help out. So I'm going to pass it over to you. You can introduce yourself, but I just wanted to start off by saying thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for being here today. And thank you, everybody that is here with us. I am really excited. Our topic today is going to be tips to incorporate language strategies into your daily routines. And we'll kind of go into like why this is important during our presentation. But just to kind of get us all kicked off, I'll share a little bit about myself. So, my name is Sydney Bassard. I am a speech language pathologist here in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, but I love where I went to school. I have a unique journey to being a speech language pathologist. Most people that enter into the field did like an undergraduate degree within the space of speech language pathology, and then they get their master's. My undergraduate's actually in public health, and then I went on to get my master's in speech language pathology. And while I was like studying to become an SLP, I also got to do some work with dyslexia and with like early intervention type stuff. So that's where I kind of got my start. My clinical areas really are working with children who are deaf and hard of hearing, individuals with dyslexia, and literacy intervention in general. I'm really happy that even though I practice clinically, I'm still heavily involved in research. So I'm actually the co-primary investigator on a research project looking at writing outcomes for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. I do own my own private practice here in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, and it's really nice to be able to connect with local schools and resources, but we also serve people throughout North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia via teletherapy. And then what I'm most known for within my field in professional spaces is I create content for the Listening SLP, which is my business and social media brand. We've gained over 21,000 followers within a 5-year span, and our goal has always been to help facilitate equity of health information, to be able for people, no matter what their socioeconomic status is, to be able to access quality information without having to necessarily go through barriers and providers. Okay, so our learning objectives that we are going to take away from today is really just to explain the benefits of using daily routines to build listening and language skills, being able to identify how to target like these daily routine and language skills through 3 daily routine activities. And then we'll talk about like how you can outline this in your own life. So, the first thing I like to talk about is language and the fact that language is literally everywhere. Oftentimes, when people are thinking of language and they're thinking of language intervention, they think of speech pathologists and they think of these like kind of concrete boxes, right? If you've ever had a child that's been in speech therapy before, it generally looks like you might be going into a room, or maybe it's like early intervention setting. You're sitting down, they're playing with them, or they're interacting with them in order to develop language. And oftentimes what's missed in those like kind of nuanced situations is that language does not just exist within the 4 walls that we have within a therapy room or any intervention space. Language is literally everywhere, from when we are washing our hands to sitting on a swing, even playing video games. I've had kids that I've worked with and I've literally told them to like bring in their Nintendo Switch, and that is what we did for an entire session as we talked about their different language skills. So we want to make sure that we're not limiting ourselves to think of language in like this one construct way. But oftentimes, let's be real, right? I know I have a number of parents on here. What's the one thing that people are always saying? What don't we have? We don't have time. Nobody ever has time to do anything extra. If you are cooking, you're cleaning, you have kids that have homework, if you're a parent that works themselves, all of these things add stressors. And so when people talk about, like, hey, we worked on this in therapy for today, I want you to try these things at home, it can lead to a lot of frustration on the end of the family, and kind of rightfully so, because you might be going, okay, that's wonderful. And I'm glad that my kid is working on these things and seeming to make progress, but you're asking me to add an additional thing to my plate. And oftentimes I've run into this when working with families. And this is why when I do professional development with other speech therapists and teachers and other paraprofessionals, like, this is a real question that people ask. When am I supposed to have time to do all of this? It leads to a lot of frustration, especially when you feel as though the professional you're working with is constantly like, well, can't you just do this? Can't you just do this? Can't you just do this? And the reality is, like, sometimes no, you can't add one more thing to your plate, or you don't have the time to think about when you're supposed to do this, especially given the fact that most families are not just dealing with one child, they might have another child, even if that child doesn't require any other special services. Just daily living can tend to be exhausting. So that is the crux of like why we use daily routines, and why I'm a big proponent of using whatever you kind of have in your environment in order to be successful with your child. So some of the benefits that we found is that like daily routines, when thinking about language, it's going to provide predictability. So it allows you to use new words and phrases, concepts, skills that you're working on in a predictable manner, because you're engaging in the same activity over and over and over again. What you're not having to do is reinvent the wheel. It doesn't have to become something that's like super sparkly, really fancy looking presentations, or like materials that people use. It doesn't have to be a whole lot of toys to where you're spending extra money. It really can just be like, hey, like, we are brushing our teeth. And so we are going to talk about like all of the things that we can with brushing our teeth. Maybe you're going over different vocabulary. Maybe you're talking about following directions. Maybe you're having your child kind of talk about the object function that you might have for your toothbrush or for your mouthwash or whatever you kind of do in the morning. And so the goal is to integrate these things into everyday living instead of trying to figure out extra times in your day where you have to sparse it out and really work on them that way. So I always like to talk about keys to success with this, right? Because it sounds good to talk about these things, but oftentimes people are like, okay, I hear you, but how am I actually supposed to implement this at home? It's not clicking for me, or I don't see the connection to my own life. And so when we're thinking of keys to success, these are things that you can do, whether you're a parent, a caregiver, or a professional, to help set children up for success. So the first thing is to be explicit and direct with our instruction. A lot of times the kids that we're working with, nuanced language can tend to be a little bit more challenging for them. So when I'm talking about nuanced language, it tends to be things that are what I call like fluff. So we're adding a bunch of additional things before we're just telling them what we exactly need them to do. That might look like when someone goes, you know, I would really like if you would clean your room, or I would really like if you put on your shoes. Okay, well, that is great and it's polite, and that is a wonderful way to talk to children sometimes. But also, you can just be direct and say, put your shoes on, go get your red coat. It's not mean in what you're saying, but it's being direct, it's explicit. And what they're doing from a language standpoint, when we're dealing with kids who do have any type of like language delay or disorder, we're kind of cutting out any of those extra pieces of language that could cause them to kind of miss the message, or for them to kind of get stuck on what we're saying. So I have a couple of examples in here that we can talk about as like scripts for what we might say. So one could be like, pour the milk into the bowl. It's very simple. It's a directive, but it's telling them exactly what you need to do, what they need to do. It doesn't have anything extra in there. If you have a child that's a little bit older, right, you could say, like, explain how ice is formed. Now, obviously, like, that can be a difficult task for a kid, especially if it's a new concept, but like, you can help guide and scaffold that conversation. What you're allowing them to do is take whatever they've talked about with how ice is formed and the process for that at school, and they're now able to tell you this at home. And it's going to be in a relaxed environment, but you're still drawing out those different things that they worked on in their day without kind of adding anything extra to it. And then let's read 5 words with the ES ending. So even when we're thinking of like reading based tasks that we might have to do with some of our kids who are struggling with reading, give a finite rule, give a finite time as far as what you need them to do. Oftentimes, what kids tend to get frustrated with, from what I've experienced professionally, is that they are asked to do something, but it feels like there's never an end. So when you say, like, you know what, I just need you to do XYZ. And then as they're doing XYZ, I tend to be a big fan of like having a whiteboard or something to where they can like check it off or they can do a mark, so that they can visually see, like, okay, we are doing the things that we need to do so that it's done. We're not belaboring the task. It doesn't feel like it's never ending and ongoing. And I can even tell you guys a story about what happened yesterday. So for the research study that I help run with one of my fellow colleagues, it's an intervention writing study. And so it's 7 weeks of intervention, which can feel like a long time. And one of the friends, like, was like, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. And so we had to have a talk. And I was like, listen, I just need you to do one more week of intervention, 3 more short sessions, you're done. And then you get your compensation for participating. And it was like the light bulb went off. And she's like, oh, yeah, I can do that. So when we do that, even in the home environment, we're helping to set that proper expectation without adding extra weight to the child. And also, too, I should have said this. If you guys have questions or thoughts throughout, please feel free to put them in the chat. Like, definitely more than happy to check the chat and answer questions as we go through. Okay, so the other key to success is repeat, repeat, repeat. The caveat with repetition is that we don't want to become like Charlie Brown's teacher, where we sound like womp, 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 because then it just becomes like drowned out, right? We do want to make repetition meaningful. So if you give a child a directive or you're talking about a particular concept, talk about it for a period or length of time. And then when that thing kind of naturally comes up again, you can talk about it again in that different situation and setting. So you're reiterating the same thing with multiple opportunities and repetition of whatever the skill and concept is without necessarily making it like a constant talking point. A lot of times when families are first starting in speech therapy, especially if their kids are really young, they might hear like, oh, repetition, it's like repeat, repeat, repeat. And then parents constantly feel like they need to be talking throughout the day. Well, that's just not reality, right? Like nobody is constantly talking throughout the day. And it becomes even laborsome, like as the adult, to feel like you need to constantly interact and engage. So know that like a 3 minute interaction or a 2 minute interaction talking about something is fine. And then you can move on with it and repeat it later on. The other thing that I always encourage families to do is to think about something as like you want to win the war. So it's okay sometimes to lose the battle. And what that means is when we're doing anything that might be repetitive, right? We know how kids can be. Sometimes they're like, I've done this at least 2 or 3 times and I'm done. Or I've said it once, I don't want to say it again. And then you're sitting there like, but I need you to say this again, or I want us to talk about this again. It's okay sometimes in those moments to just let it go and then come back in a time when it kind of naturally presents itself later to like recircle around to that same concept. Now, obviously, we can't do that with everything, right? Sometimes kids just have to kind of push through and muscle through with certain things. But if you have the opportunity to be a little bit flexible, sometimes it's okay. And you find that you get better results that way. And then, like I said, we never want to end up like this, where Olivia's like, not again from the Cosby Family. We don't want to constantly be on that repetitive loop to where kids are just saying, like, I don't want to hear this again. And I can't believe you're saying it again. Okay. So this kind of ties in a little bit with repetition. So repetition is more of like us providing that input to the kid. When we think of multiple exposures to reinforce the skills, concepts, and vocabulary, that's more so thinking about how we set up our environment. So how you can set up your environment within daily routines is like you're just living in your house or your space, your apartment, wherever you kind of live and kind of move and groove. But what you want to do to like set things up to have those multiple exposures is kind of think methodically throughout your day of like, okay, when does like whatever skill we're working on occur, or when can we talk about this concept? Ones that I like to think about are like pretty basic ones, right? If we're talking about something as over and under, easily like, oh yeah, that is sitting like on the table, or look, our microwave is hanging over our stove. My feet are under the table. Make sure that you put your shoes under your bed. And like when we're doing things like this, it can always be silly too. It doesn't have to necessarily be something that's like super structured. It can be a little bit silly. It can be fun. It can be relaxing and engaging. These are things that I find most parents are doing anyway. It's just bringing it more to a level of intentionality with how we're going about accomplishing this with our child. And then pairing activities with real world examples is going to be key. So when we are working with kids, we want to always pair things with what they are experiencing in the real world. And this is really important for my educators that are here today, because when people do this within the education setting, they can nicely help to share with families how they can do this at home. So we'll look at an example in a second, but you never want it to just be something that you're doing within the four walls of a classroom, or that you're doing within one isolated incident and then we move on, because that's not the way that we exist and live in the world. All the skills and things that we learn kind of pop up and show up in different aspects of our life. So we want the same thing to occur when we're thinking of any activity that we're working with. How can I pair this with something that they're going to see every day? And when we can think about how to do that, what it facilitates more is carryover. That is one of the biggest things that speech therapists kind of talk about amongst ourselves, and families say too, is like, wow, this child was able to do whatever skill like consecutively within therapy, but then they go off into their home environment, their school environment, and we see that they're struggling. They're not generalizing the skill, they're not carrying it over. And it's because a lot of times we're giving them these highly structured tasks to perform it in, instead of helping them to see how this goes beyond whatever we're talking about. All right, so let's think of an example of how we could do this. And so I purposely picked something that's geared a little bit more towards older children, because a lot of times these things are talked about with like littles, and it leaves people that have kids that are older kind of going like, okay, well, how do I do this with my kid? So if we're thinking about learning about the stages of matter, right? That's kind of what your child is going over in school. Things that you can do within your daily routine to talk about it, or point them out within natural occurrences, right? Okay, so let's say like we're drinking water. We can talk about, oh yeah, like I'm gonna go get a drink and this is in like its liquid form. Did you know that this was in its liquid form? If you have ice in a drink, you can talk about how ice is that solid, or like the water vapor that we might experience when we're taking a hot bath or a shower, pointing all of those different things out as they occur throughout the day are going to be beneficial and helpful. And like asking your kid, like, oh, did you have any ice in your drink today? Yeah, I did. Oh, did you know like that's when ice is like when water is a solid, and kind of engaging them in those ways. The other thing is we want to always include our senses when we are thinking of learning and engaging with new things. So like as much as you can tolerate it, because I know some people are not like big on sensory based things, but like allow your kid to touch and describe, or you can narrate what they are seeing, what they're feeling, what they're thinking, right? Like, oh, you feel this water, it's kind of like loose and it's wet. Oh, we're touching the ice, that's really cold, I don't like the way that that feels. Or like, do you see how that's a solid? Sometimes I've had kids like we pick up ice and like we'll throw it in the sink, like we talk about things in all kinds of different ways. Whichever way feels most natural to you is the way that I encourage you to do it. But as you can see, we talk about something that they could be learning in school that could be really concrete. They're learning new vocabulary, maybe such as vapor, solid, liquid, stages of matter, and you're relating it to the same things that you're doing back home without adding things else to your day. Because at some point, you're going to be either having a drink of water or another type of beverage. You probably will experience ice and things like that. Alrighty. So now we are going to talk about 3 daily routines to build language skills at home. So first we'll talk about reading a book, and we're also going to talk about textbooks and how you can use this when you are thinking of kids that are a little bit older. We'll talk about cleaning up in like routines that way. and then also cooking a meal and how that can be beneficial. So when it comes to reading a book, right? It's great to read a book. I always encourage people that when you're doing any type of book reading thing, even if it's at home, if you can make that book in some way related to the theme or the unit of study that your child is working on, that's great. If it's also just a book that they enjoy, it's the same kind of thing is fine. But when we can tie it into whatever they're discussing within the classroom, it helps to kind of bring those things back to focus, and we're able to talk about them outside of whatever they're doing within like their school setting. And we'll talk a little bit about how collaboration is important in order to achieve some of these goals as well. So then you want to identify vocabulary and phrases that you want to explicitly teach. So there are plenty of resources that are available that do this for a lot of different books and materials. I'm going to put in the chat, I'm going to pull it up really quick. But one of my favorites is Maya's Book Nook. And it's done by Dr. Lakeisha Johnson, who is a professor at Florida State University. She created like a children's blog that she named after her first daughter, Maya, and it like goes over diverse and inclusive children's books. But her resource pulls out like the vocabulary that you might want to focus on, different extension activities that you might want to do, ways that you can make the book reading more interactive. And I find that for a lot of families, like those kinds of things tend to be really helpful because it's all laid out for you. You're not having to necessarily do the digging of trying to figure some of these things out yourself, but you're able to kind of rely on other resources. My other cheat that I kind of tell people about too, as much as you're willing to, or as much as you might like it, like using some of the assistive technology that we might have, either with like ChatGPT or I use Canva a lot, which is a design tool, and they also have some AI features. And you can straight up put the prompt in there and say, my child is reading whatever book. Please find appropriate vocabulary words to emphasize based on whatever their age is or wherever they're kind of functioning at. So when we think of vocabulary and things we want to focus on, we have 3 tiers of vocabulary, and I'm a sweets girl. I love sweets and cakes and all of those things, probably a little bit more than I should. So I like to think of the 3 tiers of vocabulary in the same way that I think of the 3 tiers of a cake, right? So my tier 1 is going to be my base. It's going to be the biggest piece of my cake, and it's going to make up the majority of our vocabulary words that we're using. We might call these high frequency words, or you can think of them as everyday words. These are words that we are encountering every day, such as like cat, dog, ball, hat, shoes. Most children don't need to be explicitly taught these, but there are some kids that do, and that's perfectly fine. You can explicitly teach kids these words too, if you feel as though that's what's going to be most appropriate for them with it, like how they're functioning. Then we have our tier 2 words, and this is what we consider more of like our academic language or academic vocabulary. These are words that we're going to see across different academic settings. They tend to be a little bit more scholarly than the things that we might talk about in everyday, like vocabulary. And we're going to see more of these types of words within our writing context, right? We're not going to necessarily use some of these words in how we talk every day, just because it's not how we walk around speaking, but you will see them show up a lot more in written text. And then finally, we have our specialized vocabulary, and that's our top tier of our cake. So it's the smallest one. I tend to think of these and call them my cardiologist words, only because if you have not had a lot of experience with a cardiologist, which like I hope that you haven't, it's not a lot of fun, you may not know certain words when someone is talking about like an aorta, a bicuspid, a valve, triple bypass, or things like that. It might go over your head. Every field and space or like niche group kind of has these different specialized vocabularies that are more geared towards them than others. But when we're thinking about the area that we want to spend time with our children when we're engaging in book reading, we really want it to be within that tier 2 vocabulary space, that academic vocabulary. That's where we want to spend a lot of our time and really focus on. And when we're going over vocabulary, we want to make sure that we're providing them with like the child-friendly definition of a word and giving it to them in another different context so that they understand it. Even ourselves, after we've read the book, and you might have read the same book and story many, many times, like you're going to talk about the vocabulary. Oh, yeah, remember that word we were reading the other night? Yeah, like we could use that word here. Maybe you use it in a sentence. Ask your child what it means and define it. I find that even for myself at times, right, thinking of what vocabulary were like how to define some of these words can be tricky, and it doesn't naturally come to mind. So here are two resources. One is Longman Dictionary, and one is Collins Cobill Dictionary. So neither one of these are Merriam-Webster, and that's okay. They tend to help give a little bit more child-friendly based definitions. So you can always pop in the word that you're looking for there and kind of filter through to see what they have for you. Right, reading the book. So we want to read it multiple times throughout the week. I know that sometimes we're like, golly, do we have to read the same book again? And the answer is each time you read a book should have a different purpose, focus, and emphasis. So fun fact, you don't have to read the book word for word on the page. A lot of times I actually don't read books when I'm working with families word for word for what it's written on the page. What I might do is read a couple of sentences on that particular page. If there's a sentence that I could skip that's not going to seriously alter the story, maybe I'm going to do that. Maybe I'm going to summarize it, especially if you have a kid that is really just struggling with language and they have some attention based things too. You can just kind of roll your finger as if you are actually reading the book, but you're not necessarily reading everything word for word. And that provides you with the opportunity to talk about pictures and other things of that nature. Also, too, what you can do is first time you read a book, we're just trying to get an understanding of it. Then the next time you're reading a book, we're talking about it a little bit more. We're talking about how some of these things might play into our daily routines, how they might see them present themselves within your family unit. And maybe the third time, we're drawing a picture about it, or we are sharing about it with our neighbor, our other siblings. However you want to do it is perfectly fine. But you're still getting those multiple repetitions in without it necessarily being reading the book for word. This is also too where I encourage people, if they can, having a book library almost in their car. So I know cars get junky and messy, but if you can have just one or two of their favorites that are in the car, especially if you're a family that spends a lot of time in the car, either driving to and from school or appointments, it's a nice opportunity for them to kind of look through some of the books that you guys have read over and over again. And the nice part for you as the parent is you don't have to sit there and read the book with them. You can kind of know how the story goes. You can talk about it with them. You guys can interact that way without it adding something extra to your day. Okay. And then, as always, we want to create those opportunities to use the new vocabulary phrases throughout the week. So whether we're engaging in play, whether we're doing a particular activity, we want to encourage the child to use these concepts. Don't just focus on oh, we went over it this one time and now we're not doing it again. See how we can make it engaging for them. So I have a couple of videos. Oh gosh. Okay, well, they decided to autoplay on their own. So I have a couple of videos of examples from when I've done some things in therapy that are kind of like this. So one is based off of we were focusing on hair and hair care routines and what that might look like going to a barber versus if you are have longer hair, what it might look like if you need to go to a stylist, and different ways that we can interact with play that way. So we will look at that video first, and then I'll talk a little bit about the second video. I don't know if you guys can hear the sound. Let me know. Let me see. I don't think you'll be able to hear the sound, which might be a problem, but we'll try it and kind of see how it goes from there. Okay. So I don't know if you could hear the sound or not. No, couldn't hear it, Carrie. Okay. But what you could see was still the visuals and the words kind of go up, right? So like if we are reading books about a haircut, or if you have a kid that has a haircut coming up, like you can pretend to cut hair. I will say I really do like that Play-Doh toy, but it can be a little bit messy. So like that one requires a little bit of work. They have other ones that are out there that aren't as messy, but it's fun, right? Like we're talking about the clippers and the scissors and the different experience that they may have at the barber and what that's going to look like and kind of feel like. Same thing like with like people that have longer hair, what it's going to feel and look like to get it cut, what actions are going to have to be taken, what prep work do we need to do before we even go to get our hair cut or styled or done. All of those different things are language rich, and you're still able to use a daily routine of something you'd have to do in order to facilitate language. All right, you won't be able to hear the sound on this next video either, but we'll go ahead and let it play and then we'll talk about it. So this book is another one of my favorites. It's called Grandma's Purse. It's all about a little girl who her grandma comes to visit, and they literally sit there and go through like all the different things and items in her grandma's bag. Okay. So you can do so many things even with that activity, right? Like we've read the book, we've talked about what they did in the story, and then like they can pack their own bag, or like as much as you feel comfortable, they can go through your purse or your book bag. You can even just like make a special one for them to go through. We can talk about all the things in it, the different object functions that you have with those things, trying to remember what exactly was in the bag. Like I said, I think that being silly and making language interactions with children fun. So sometimes I put like silly things in there, right? Like I might put a shoe in there, or put like something random, like maybe slime or something that they like in there, and be like, oh, does that actually belong in my bag? No, that does not need to go in there. So talking about those things also makes it interacting and engaging as well. And then finally, with book reading, this particular slide is for any professional I have in the room, but it's tell the families about what you are addressing in class and then provide examples. I think one thing that families love to hear about is like what actually is going on in the classroom. What is their child learning about? How can they carry this over at home? I will say this with 100% confidence. I've never met a family that did not want their child to succeed. Any family I've ever worked with, like the end goal is always like, I want my child to succeed. I want my child to do well. But one thing that families often say is like, I don't know what's going on, or I'm struggling to kind of figure out how I can encourage and help my kid at home. And that's accurate. And there's some barriers even on the educator side of that with like time. But when you create almost like a script and outline of yourself of what you do, you can easily send that to all the families. And this is kind of what we worked on. And this is some examples of how you can carry it over. It's a little piece of information that's being communicated, but it means the world to families, and it helps to set everybody up to be successful with the child. All right. So what about textbooks? So we talked about like narratives and like books that we might use with like that K through third grade population. But what are we doing for our kids that are older, that are far beyond using like any type of child book like that? How can we support them? And the biggest thing is you're going to use the curriculum to your advantage. Like I said, our goal with daily routines is not to reinvent the wheel. Our goal is to use what we have to our best advantage. So I really like this, and I can I'll send this to Carrie. She can send this to you guys. I do have a PDF of it, and I should have downloaded to send it to you guys beforehand. But it goes over how you can do activities that are related to textbooks, particularly for instructional purposes, but also to thinking about like carryover for within the home. So obviously, you have to know like what they're going to be going over in the class. This is where it's helpful when like we collaborate and communicate with families, and everybody kind of knows where we're at. You can also ask the teacher like what ideas and concepts and vocabulary have been addressed. And then the goal is like you can work with your professionals. So families don't have to do this all on their own. I always encourage people when we're doing therapy to bring in like whatever materials, reading materials, textbooks that their child is going over in school. And then we can segment out the textbook based on like the child's ability there. So then we're going to go through it for pre-reading activities, Any words that might be difficult to read, we want to make sure that we've gone through them, that the child has a good understanding of vocabulary and concepts. That if there are any like graphs and charts and visuals, especially when we start thinking about more of our hard sciences, that we know exactly what they're saying and how, like the importance to the material that we're going over. And then this one is key that I find a lot of people skip over. Textbooks, most of them, have been written with the idea to help you to understand the material, right? So, how do they do that? They have end of chapter questions. I always encourage the older kids I work with, like, use the textbook to your advantage. Go read through the end of chapter or end of section questions and use that almost as a guide as you're reading, because it's telling you right there in those 5 or 6 questions they have at the end what really your focus and emphasis from the information should be. So you're going to use that as your guide. Going over the title, any subheadings, summaries that are right there, using all of those things to kind of get their mind like warmed up by pre-teaching them some of the information. So then you can go through any type of reading activities. And then at the end, you can have some answer with written questions for summarizing the content, reviewing the content in groups. And so for families where you can do this is like take some of these things that they've done and you're going to go back and you're going to review them with them. You can ask them about these concepts. You can have them explain them to you. If a child is able to explain a concept to you, you know, far more that they have an understanding of that concept because they're able to articulate it to you or someone else versus like sometimes just question and answer. We don't necessarily always know, especially if it's multiple choice, right? You can just do like process of elimination. And if you're a good test taker, be able to figure some of those things out. So have them explain it to you. And even if they're struggling a little bit, that's where you can help them. You can guide them, help give them the vocabulary words and things that they're talking about. So we've talked a lot about book reading, which is great, and how we can use our textbook to help support these things as well. But the biggest thing is like collaboration is key. No one should be operating in a silo. And the reality is that we can't operate in silos if we want to be successful with implementation. So we need to find out what concepts or themes are being covered in the child's class throughout the year. This is where a little bit of communication with everybody tends to be really helpful. If you have your whole year plan, that's great. If you have things that are just planned for like a couple of weeks or a month at a time, that's also great. Just use whatever you have and communicate it. This is why personally, I like to write my lesson plans or like what I'm going over in a way that is easy for me to understand, but also easy for me to give it to the family and say, here you go. These are the kind of things and concepts that we're going to be working on. And then ask the general education teacher, your child's speech therapist, to incorporate these literacy concepts into everyday life, but also these language concepts too. Have them work on the vocabulary that they're addressing in school and like tie it into the sessions. Have them work on any language structures. If your child is struggling with being able to talk about things in irregular past tense, and they have some things that they've talked about in school that would naturally lend itself to that, tell the person how they can work on this within therapy. Any type of simple phonological awareness activities, whether we're segmenting, kind of pulling those words apart, or we're blending, putting them together. Those things can also be worked on. It does not have to always be in its own individual silo with services. Okay, so thinking about cleaning up or pack up time just kind of depend. So for my preschoolers, right, like we can always use a common song, such as like a cleanup song or a common phrase, time to clean up. And you're going to say that repetitively. And then like you can add a spin to it, like, oh, time to clean up the cars or time to clean up the kitchen area. I need you to put up, and then you can list the things off if you're working more on like memory or following directions, whatever you're trying to use. So that's for my younger kids. But our goal is always to add complexity to it. We don't ever want it to just be stagnant where it's just like time to clean up, time to clean up, time to clean up. Adding complexity can look different depending on what you're working on. So I can say like clean up the cars. Okay, that's pretty simple. Clean up the blue cars. So I've added a little bit of complexity because I've added the word blue there. Before you clean up the blue cars, make sure to wipe the table off. Well, I just added a whole lot of complexity. It's still the same type of direction, but now I've added like a time sensitive thing of before, right? Still the same part of like cleaning up the blue cards. So I still have my blue complexity piece plus my cards. Now I've added a whole nother like concept and direction to the same thing. So thinking about like how you can add complexity within your routine is going to be important. And this also really just depends on the age of where your child is at. And then, like I said, as always, we want to make sure that we are communicating. So, providing families with structures being targeted to reinforce at home. Whatever is being addressed within the academic spaces and within your therapy sessions, you want to know those so that you can reinforce them at home. And if you're like, okay, they told me, but I don't know how to do that or what that means, ask for a couple of examples. Examples tend to help, and it helps solidify information for people. Okay, and then finally, this is one of my favorite things, right? Cooking a meal. So I love to eat, and I think that meal times within family units are beautiful. That's when we tend to see a lot of people collaborate with each other, spend time together, but also too where a lot of language learning and kind of like talking and building goes on within our day. So when we're thinking about cooking a meal, we can think about basic concepts that we can incorporate, right? Like before, after, while, all, some, none. Those are great things that we could talk about within that setting because you need to be able to follow the cooking directions. We could include critical elements. So that's like our colors, any type of quantity that we have there, spatial concepts that we might need to have. We can focus on these auditory memory skills of like, here's a list of steps that we need to do or a list of items we need, asking the child to kind of recall some of those things for you. If you have a kid that you're like, we're working on spelling and writing, like have them write out the instructions. It doesn't have to be like super long, lengthy paragraph, but just like, okay, I need you to help me write down the steps so that I can remember how to bake this chicken. And then you can always have your kid engage in like retell. So telling about like what we just did, what we're engaged with. And when you get them involved, we know sometimes this can't happen, right? Sometimes it's like you just need to cook the meal and we don't have time to do this. But when you do, like it allows after it's done, you can talk about this over dinner. We can talk about the different things that we engaged with. And like I mentioned before, especially as kids are getting older and the language demands are getting more within their science related coursework and their like social studies and mathematics, you can start incorporating some of those types of concepts into cooking a meal very easily. We just have to like think about it a little bit. All right. So, what are our big takeaways for today? So, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. So, the first thing is that language is everywhere. Language is not confined to just like when we are engaging in conversation, but we can literally find language in every aspect of life that we're going through. Whether we're eating a snack and we're talking about its crunchy and the different textures that we might be having, or we're telling somebody about our day, or we're reading a book and sharing in that experience, or we're just like going through everyday life and having to like read and then summarize like a document that we read. Language is all around us, and we don't want to be afraid to just think of language in one finite box. Our goal as educators, though, is always to capitalize on these moments that we have to build listening and language skills. We don't want to just like let all of these little moments go by and say, oh, it's not a big deal. And this is the same thing for families. Figuring out how we can capitalize on these moments, it's going to be huge and major. We don't want to sit there and let them all go by. But we also don't have to capitalize on all of them too. It's okay to just live life and not like try to make it into a language opportunity or moment. And then third, we always want to highlight ways for families to use their daily routines to build language skills for their child. That is a key thing. People are stressed between work, between family activities and obligations that they might have within and outside of the home. It can be very stressful. And then adding into any appointment or other thing can feel overwhelming for a lot of people. So figuring out how we can help others highlight and capitalize on their moments is going to help to lessen that burden so that everybody feels like they are benefiting the child without necessarily burning themselves out. All righty. Well, thank you guys so much. So if you scan this QR code, it'll take you to a Talkadot link. So you can just like, it has a couple of emojis that you can click to just kind of say what you thought about today. and overall any feedback that you might have for me. But it was a pleasure kind of presenting to you guys. We're definitely going to have time for some questions. And then I can also put the link for that in the chat. I know we have some people that might be on their phone, so you can either scan this link or I'm going to put this one in the chat as well. But it just takes you to like an example of like a daily routine, just schedule for how you can incorporate language for a child. So I'm going to pull that up and then share that with you guys in the chat. And then otherwise, let me see.
Sydney, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I know just even myself listening to you, and many know this, I have a 5-year-old at home, and even something as simple as you sharing the link to the 2 different like dictionary options. Like that's huge. I did not realize how many times a day Kennedy was going to ask me what a word means, and I have absolutely no idea how to tell her what that word means. Like it has been very humbling, to say the least. So you shared a lot of really great resources, and I know everyone here appreciates it. So with that being said, I'm going to stop the recording so that if anybody else wants to ask questions, they are able to. Second.